Good evening to each of you, and a Happy New Year also. This series of lectures, I will begin with a few statements about my intention. This will not be a normal series on the planets, as one might hear in going to a lecture about astrology. I'm not really going to be taking information from astrology. We'll touch, of course, on astrology in the discussion, but that will not be the goal. As was hinted at in the description of the lecture given in the PRS program, instead, the planets here are being referred to in the way that they're symbols that were used in the ancient mysteries. Now, a series of lectures that were just completed on Mr. Hall's secret teachings are very much related to this topic, and I'll briefly say a few things from those lectures so that you can get an idea of what I mean by a symbol, and also how these symbols will work and how we'll use them in our series of lectures on the planets. And then we'll go to the moon and talk about that. I'd like to define a symbol for these lectures as a kind of gathering of experience into the simplest pictorial representation. Now that experience can be, that symbol in other words, can be interpreted in as many ways as there are people who regard it. There is therefore no correct interpretation of the moon as a symbol. There are as many interpretations as any one of us could dream up. All of them are correct. Now that may be rather maddening to those of us who are used to the mathematical problem kind of solution when thinking of mysteries, and that's part of the beauty of the metaphysical disciplines. The simple fact that what we're dealing with here is a system of self-unfoldment. Each of these symbols is intended to, first of all, engage our interest, and then slowly give us the kind of challenge that will enable us to understand things about ourselves. And through these understandings, we can achieve the spiritual potential within us. Therefore, each of these interpretations we give the symbol serve to reflect, to act as mirrors for us. And we can see ourselves, we can read ourselves in them. In other words, when we look at the moon, the purest interpretation would be for each of us to go stand outside, even now, and look at the moon and ask ourselves what it means to us. What does it make us think of? What inside ourselves, or what in our life experience, is like that moon? And here we would have a very pure form of interpretation. We also have a tradition that has been called the mystery tradition. And keeping in mind that definition of a symbol, you can certainly understand one derivation of the word mystery. It's also confusing. But on the other hand, mysteries are so enticing. And the beauty about the mystery tradition is that through its quiet glamour, in a sense, it drew in people and relieved them of the desire for glamour and brought them into the understanding that the greatest mystery in all creation was not in a temple, was not in the head or hands of some great hierophant of the mysteries, but is within each of us in our hearts. The origin of the mystery tradition is not in Egypt or in India. It is within each of us. It originated from human hearts, from human experience, and if we wish to understand it, we must seek it not through archaeology, but through deep inner search. So it's in that tradition that the planets, as we know them, leaving out the planets that have been called higher octave, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and we'll discuss those when the proper time comes. But the main planets known to the Ptolemaic system represented constellations of human experience. They were very handy symbols, a kind of shorthand for those who had the sensitivity to understand them. So that in using the symbol of the moon, for example, an entire area of human experience, an entire area of the universe could be described. One little symbol. Any of you who have done work in astrology may perhaps have had little notebooks in which you had nothing but these symbols. Sun, triangle, moon. Now someone not initiated into the history or into the language of astrology would have no idea what that symbol meant. But in it, you said, first of all, sun, trine, moon. And beyond that, if you really know your astrology, you said whole pages, maybe books of information about a person's character, about a certain dynamic. And if any of you have ever had the pleasure or misfortune, depending on how well you know your astrology, to listen to two rabid astrologers talk about some aspect of a chart, you probably have understood almost nothing about it because of all these weird words that they were using. It's like physics or something, a very specialized form of human effort. So, in effect, I will be drawing in these lectures on the mystery tradition, on the tradition of symbolism discussed in Mr. Hall's Secret Teachings, to define these various planets. And once again, there will be areas in which they relate to the planets of astrology. In other ways, they'll differ a little bit. And I hope that in the way they differ, a special insight will be given to each of you. Now, a second proviso that I have to make clear before I begin discussing the moon is that it would be impossible to discuss any one of these planets without discussing the others. So that what I say when I say that this lecture is on the moon is that the focus or the emphasis is on the moon. There is no way to take the moon part of human experience or the universe away from the rest of human experience and the universe and look at it as though in a microscope all by itself. It's going to be very much interrelated with the other planetary aspects. And I will mention each of the other planets in their place, and it's not that I'm trying to confuse you or give all the lectures at once. It's just that that's the only way that we can really get a sense of contrast. And also, since these lectures are most devoted to the way that we can, let's say, increase the energy or the quality of the energy of these planets in our lives or of the places in our lives that they function, it will be important to realize that some of the confusion, some of the suffering that we all go through is because we mistake one kind of energy for another. We get ourselves embroiled in confusions of energies, and that it can help us to just name various constellations within our experience and see that they differ from each other. An example would be emotion and thought. It's very popular to make a differentiation there, but if you look into your own experience, it's quite difficult, really. At extremes, you can. If you're working perhaps on a mathematical problem, you can say that that's about as close to pure thought as you could get. There's very little emotion functioning there. But then on the other hand, a mathematician who's on the verge of discovering something in his equation may be absolutely full of emotion, almost mystical ecstasy. And on the other extreme, it may be that when we simply have a feeling of happiness we can't explain, we're having pure emotion there. Yet there are all sorts of thoughts and images that arise with that emotion. So in discussing the moon, for example, we will also be discussing Mercury, a planet that has to do with thought in the mystery tradition. And we'll be discussing ways that those become confused and cause trouble. Now, to begin our discussion about the moon. The Greeks, the Gnostics, the Neoplatonists, the whole mystery tradition as a whole, in fact, referred to this world as the sublunary world. In other words, the world below the moon. And hand in hand with that name was the idea that this world is a kind of chaos. It's a confusing place, ceaselessly changing, perhaps best imaged by an oceanic surface, just waves, nothing to hold on to, nothing to place the eye on for any kind of reference. Ceaseless change. I'd like to demonstrate that, just in case there's any doubt about it. First of all, I'd like to demonstrate it by a reference to science, and to point out that at this moment, had we the proper interests, the proper instruments also, we could look into the future. We could look also into the past. Now, I'm not talking about anything as exotic as a time machine. If we had a telescope here, and each of us could look out the window at a star, we would be seeing the past. The light of that star, by the time it reaches us, may be years old. And so when we look into the sky, we are literally seeing the past. We are not seeing the stars as they are now. The sun's light itself comes to us with a 6-minute delay. In other words, when we get up in the morning and look at the sun and marvel at that beautiful light, Something may have happened on the sun at that very instant we would not be aware of for 6 full minutes. So the future is in the heavens. Then again, if we had a microscope, we could look into the world of cells, and if we had an even better, perhaps an electron microscope, we could look into the world of matter particles themselves. And in doing that, in a sense, we would be looking at the future in the way that it is. I realize I've just confused you. The heavens are the world of the future in the sense of astrology, but in the sense of physics, they're the world of the past. Excuse me. The world of the future is in the cells and in the particles. And the way that is because we, for example, are made up of all these particles and cells. And as something stirs up in us, some energy field begins to stir, as cells begin to respond, we may not be aware of it. At this very moment, there may be a reaction of chemicals going on in our bodies that we won't become aware of as a sensation for minutes. So here we have the sense of the past and the future, the very tiny elementary structure of this world, in a sense, being our future coming into fruition, so small that it has not yet reached expression in our world as we know it. And then the great world of the stars, available to us only in its passage, only in the past, only in its echo or shadow. We don't have to go that far to find the world as a sublunary region, a region of change. I'd like to point out that there are 2 reasons why the moon was used as a symbol for this. One is the fact that in the heavens the moon is ceaselessly changing. We see it in its crescents, we see it full, we don't see it at all at the new moon. It has a quick cycle of roughly 28 days. So it's a symbol to us of this constant change. There's, of course, also the relationship between human fluids and the ocean and the moon, which was observed by the ancients. And so we have there also this relation to change. But then there's another interesting fact, which is that on the vast cosmic time scale, if we take, for instance, a rotation of our solar system around its part of the galaxy, and then we adjust for time, the moon, in comparison, in that amount of time, speed-wise, would be like a shell around the Earth. In the very same way that electrons spinning around their proton center make a solid surface to us. So you could say that to a tremendous, gigantic, godlike creature, the moon would be like a hard shell around the Earth. The difference in time entering there again. And on an even more immediate level, we have our wonderful selves to think about. We have the confusion of emotions, thoughts, desires, all the different memories that we have. One day we remember one thing, the next day we forget it. We can't bring it to mind. We might have a memory for no apparent reason that we hadn't had for years. Think of something that happened to us decades ago. Then on the other hand, we may have a desire for something which our thought denies us. Or then again, we may think we should do a certain thing, but we cannot bring ourselves to do it. Desire will not permit it. All of these confusions lead us to ask, where do we place the identity? Are we our emotions? Do we identify with them? And is thought some sort of an external thing that simply comments on our emotions? Or are we perhaps our thoughts, as the rational might wish? And our emotions are merely some sort of biological influence that we have to overcome. In the lecture that I gave on Sunday, I don't want to repeat too much of it, I suggested that by a process of questioning ourselves, we can come to an interesting realization. And in short, the process of questioning goes like this. Am I my body? When we think about that for a little while, we'll realize that we can't really say that we're our body. There are many good reasons for that. Among them are the fact that we very often have a sense of disassociation from the body. When we're in severe pain, for example, there can be a sense of being the watcher of that pain. If any of you have really been in severe pain, you may have reached a stage where you stopped feeling it, although the body itself was still involved in whatever action that was. But further beyond that, we have the most interesting of all, and perhaps the most painful of all human experiences, which is that of looking in the mirror as the years pass. The person within doesn't change. There are some differences in maturity of thought and emotion, but in general, it's the same person looking out of the 20-year-old's eyes as looks out of the 70-year-old's eyes, and the difference is in the body. Now, some of us may convince ourselves by looking at the body that we ourselves have somehow essentially aged, but any of you who have been fortunate enough to know individuals who are 80 going on 10 realize that that's not the case, that there are those who are in their 80s, and we can think of one who usually sits downstairs from here, whose memories, intellect, sense of humor, awareness is clearer than that most young people have. It's certainly as clear as anyone might hope. So the possibility is at least there, that we can have this pure, alive consciousness, unaged, within this aging body. So, not the body. What about the emotions? Well, as soon as we touch on the emotions, once again, we've got to touch on thought. And we've got this conflict that usually rages in us. Thought would like one thing, emotions would like something else. Occasionally they both agree, and then we throw ourselves into something. Occasionally they both decide something isn't for us, and then we've got an easy decision. But how often does it happen that our emotions want one more of something that our mind tells us we shouldn't have? Or on the other hand, that our mind has a terrific idea for our future, but our emotions just rebel and refuse to allow it to happen. Now, which one are we? There again we can begin to think about. Now, I'd hate to place identity on thought. A careful analysis of your own thinking will show that it's quite possible to hold an opinion one moment and the opposite the next. A good argument will often do that for you. It will show you that your most dearly held belief can absolutely be reversed when you have this particular perception about something. And then on the other hand, thought can often appear to us, if we, for instance, attempt to meditate or to silence thought, as this tremendous chattery little monkey that's running about in our field of consciousness and we just can't quiet down. And once again, there's this sense that this isn't it either. It's not the thoughts. And the emotions fall down in a similar way. Most of us have had, when we're especially tired, sometimes when we're not, strange desires. All sorts of emotions we feel it's a good thing we didn't act on. That's part of human experience. And those emotions are things that indicate to us within a certain extent that our identity is not completely there either. We continue to do this process, naming parts of ourselves, memory and such, and discovering that no, that's not it, until we're left with no thing, with nothing. And here's an interesting key to Buddhism, which says there is no self, there is no soul. That's a very subtle teaching. It is not to say that there is no immortal principle. If you press the Buddhist, they will tell you that there is some kind of an energy. There is the impulse of past actions that incarnates in each successive lifetime. Now that isn't a very logical statement. We wonder about that. If we think about the fact that Buddhists are masters of a teaching that is called upaya, and to put it in a terribly literal English fashion, that means to lie in order to teach. The idea being that all words lie, and you might as well tell a good one to get your point across. We have the fact that what the Buddhist is trying to do by telling us there is no self, there is no soul, is scare us, shock us, out of our contentment in the idea that there is one. Now, if you teach reincarnation to a person, there may be the individual, and I suggest there are more than one might like to think, because they're lurking inside all of us, who feels that, well, I've got all creation. I've got millions of years to learn the right path. I can do anything I want, really. The universe allows me that, if reincarnation is true. And there's a certain amount of truth in that observation. Now, the argument given back to that is, yes, that's true, but you will suffer for what you do. And certainly there are those who will say, fine, I'll suffer. At this point, I'd rather do it. But going beyond that, if we say there is no self, there is no soul, we throw a wrench into the works. Suddenly the question arises, as we've been pursuing, well then what am I? If there is no I, if there is no soul, if the mind is nothing but a bunch of influences from the world congealed for a moment, dissipated the next instant, what am I? An offered answer, one that I think is perhaps the best, was given by Sri Ramana Maharshi, who was one of the teachers of Sir Evans Wentz, the great teacher of Tibetan doctrine around the turn of the century. And that is that when you take all that stuff away, all the emotions, all the thoughts, the body, the sensations, the memories, the senses, you're what's left. Now what, you might ask, is left when you take all that away? And the answer is quite simple: awareness. That sense that gives unity to all these elements. You perceive your thoughts. You perceive your emotions. You perceive sensations. You look, in a sense, through your senses and perceive aspects of the world. Psychology has proven that you actually select aspects of the world according to your predisposition. And it's an interesting thought to think that if we could have a fairly complete record of what each of us in this room was seeing, and we were decently intuitive, we might be able to reason out exactly what each of us had come here for, what sorts of predispositions we had about philosophy, astrology, whatever. In general, what our orientation toward life was. Because you will see, you will hear, you will know what tends to support what you believe, what you've come here to see. Very seldom are we fortunate enough to be startled by something really new. Now, most often those startling reactions come with something similar to the Zen Roshi's slap, and that brings us back to the idea, the Buddhist notion of no soul, no self. So all we have is this eternal awareness, this part of us that simply looks out, in a sense, and has this swirling cavalcade of experiences, all these different voices, all these sounds, inside and outside, all these different predilections, all these memories. And here we have this ocean of generation. Now, the idea seemed to be that this ocean, this mass that all of us face, was ruled by some kind of rhythm, that there was a divine order in it, and that that rhythm was quite similar to the changes in the moon, or the tides, to any of the natural changes, such as the seasons that we can perceive in the world. And so the moon became an excellent symbol for that combination of the divine order with this world, this massive, ever-changing world. An illustration of that, a very personal one, would be the fact that if you could imagine for a moment, if you could look out at whatever it is you happen to see, and imagine that all you were seeing were colors, shapes, and textures. In other words, you didn't think that this is a person, and that's a person, and this is a person, and that's a chair, and that's a piece of statuary. But rather, all you saw without any differentiation were colors, textures, shapes. No sense of any identity given to them. There was just this mass out here. You realize that you are imposing your own order in the world. You are making sense out of all this. An interesting story was told to me today by a rather elderly man who told me that he remembered his first instant of feeling separation. And that instant was when walking around, toddling underneath the dinner table, and looking up at all the adults' legs and their bottoms of their torsos, he started to wonder, what must it be like to see from up there? I know I see through these eyes. What would it be like to see through those eyes up there? What do they see? And an instant later, he realized that he would never be able to see through those eyes up there, that they were separate from him. There was the separation. Here was the first time, perhaps, that that particular individual, that soul, began to impose a kind of order on the world of himself and the other, all the rest of the world. Up to that point, apparently, there had not been that sense. The world was a miraculous whole. When he cried, he was fed. Perhaps a little later, perhaps a little sooner. He'd cry a little bit harder. We doubt that he had a measure for just how much he needed to cry. There was just a sense that the world was all one happy place. It was all functioning. If it was miserable or happy, actually, it was just one great montage of actions, experiences, and events. Now, in order to get along in the world, we have to begin to differentiate all that. And what we begin to draw on, and here's the symbolism of the moon, are these rhythms that function in life. And here we begin the essence of this lecture. How do we begin to draw on these rhythms? Well, first of all, chances are that there's a parent around us, most often the mother, some significant adult who takes care of us. And we perhaps first differentiate them. They become a tremendous symbol for us. And it is certainly no surprise that when looking for powerful religious symbols, we keep finding mothers, whether it be the Virgin Mary, whether it be Isis. We're continually finding them. Now, that's besides the fact that a mother, a womb, the matrix of all this world in a sense, is a tremendous symbol. It's also the simple fact that mothers are most often our first symbols. They're our first real contact with the world. We begin to figure out what the place is like through their reactions, through their behavior. We begin to judge what we have to do in terms of their responses, in other words, so that if we cry, we get fed. There's a kind of symbol there. Or then again, if we smile, we get smiled back at. There's another kind of symbol about how we can act toward the world. As we get older, we pick a few more symbols, maybe a child or two, a few more adults. And this process of understanding becomes a little bit more complex. We begin to pick up, for instance, reactions, and this is one of the most lamentable, but in some ways humorous aspects of parental and child relations, and that is the fact that we can talk ourselves blue in the face about how wonderful the world is and tell our child there's nothing to worry about. Everything is fine. And then every time we answer the phone, we grimace because we're expecting bad news. We think, well, he's a child, he doesn't notice that. Not true. Actually, the words will be far less effective than the facial expressions, the tension. Now, almost every one of you, perhaps everyone, has the experience of walking into a room. This is particularly good with a family member, and a spouse is a particularly good person to notice this with, and knowing instantly there's going to be a fight. There's some kind of tension in the air. You can't really put your finger on it. You don't see a thing, but you feel this kind of tension. Now, I ask you, how much more sensitive is a child who, first of all, doesn't have the luxury of distractions that we all do, 1,000 things we can spend our attention on, and to whom that significant person is a gigantic symbol? Well, you can bet that they're reading every nuance of that symbol's behavior, and they're interpreting it for all they're worth. Now, that's a painful process, and somewhere down the line, for various reasons, one of them being that we discover all sorts of other distractions, we begin to become less interested in interpreting the world. And that's when suffering comes into the picture, in the sense that suffering aids us to seek out answers. Suffering is nature's way, in a sense, of slapping us a little harder and harder when the time comes, if we're not alert enough, and getting us to pay attention to what's around. If life were all simple and ease, we wouldn't be down here trying to figure out the mystery of it. We'd simply be enjoying it. So apparently, at least as things stand now, we're all supposed to be learning something about it. And as that process of learning begins, we begin to analyze our world, to look for rhythms in it. And those rhythms we're looking for are symbolized by the moon. And also symbolized by the moon are all the confusions that we can find while searching for that symbolism. In the title of this lecture, I use the phrase, one of these horrible generalities, in referring to the moon, emotionalism to intuition, clearing the emotional senses. I'd like to define those words for you. First, by emotionalism, let's describe that word as meaning a kind of immersion in emotion to our own detriment without it providing any aid whatsoever, a kind of habitual crystallization into modes of behavior that are harmful to us. In other words, that don't gain us any kind of understanding or spiritual progress. In other words, by emotionalism is meant being afloat or drowning, if you like, in that sea of change. Not being able to understand what's happening to us, feeling that somehow the entire world has let us down, that we are suffering unjustly. Simply, nothing makes sense. The world looks like a chaos from that perspective. And you can see here, of course, that we have to add Mercury and Neptune and all the other planets into this picture. They're all dragged in. But the point is, we're immersed in that part of the moon that is purely without form. Now, what do we mean by intuition? Intuition comes from a Latin root that basically means to see. And I can't really be any clearer than that. It's going from that chaos to seeing how the current works, seeing how we can find a way to float along, to get where we want to go, or to at least see where it is we're going. And what do we mean by emotional senses? There's a very handy phrase that the Theosophists use, and that's the emotional body. Theosophy is one of those wonderful, confusing systems of thought that has all those catchphrases, and they all sound real good, and if we bother to memorize them, we may someday discover they actually have meaning, which is a delightful discovery. They don't simply refer to airy abstractions out there. They refer to things that we experience. Now consider that when we're born here, we've got this body that doesn't work very well. In a sense, it's a rather slimy thing for most of us. We just don't have the knack of it. We can't make the muscles work. We can't make things close or open when we want. Everything is just confusion. And it takes us years to get the knack of how to get these things to work right, so we can pick something up or walk or do any of those wonderful things, speak for that matter. Now the emotional body is the next body we have to learn to use. And unfortunately, many of us are very much like infants in our emotional body. We can't turn it on or off when we want to. We don't know how the valves in the thing work. We don't know how the hands go. We don't know how to walk in it. We don't know how to do anything with it. It's just this mess, this chaos. So we have to learn how to use those muscles. We have to learn how to begin to differentiate a little bit what we see. We have to learn how to turn it off and turn it on at certain times. Now this is learning to use our emotional senses. And they are remarkable things. I'd be tempted to tell you that a great deal of psychic activity functions on the basis of what we might call the emotional senses. Now, if you consider the fact that your average psychic is an individual who has accepted to a great degree things that most of us would not be willing to accept. And a great example are the various sleeping prophets, the most famous being Edgar Cayce, who are actually willing to lay down and let some apparently discarded entity speak through them. That is a feat of tremendous trust. And beyond that, it shows a kind of relaxation, or, if you like, acceptance of life that most of us don't have. Edgar Cayce, for example, did all his work sleeping. And that might sound dandy to us, but it certainly wasn't for him. He spent more time sleeping than awake. But yet, there was this commitment to the idea that something useful was coming from it. Now, if we add this to the conscious psychic, who has accepted the idea, true or false, that there are all sorts of entities, perhaps one, speaking through him or her, this is a person who has accepted many things that we as individuals may not have. In other words, once again, they're much more relaxed about their emotions and about their perceptions. And a lot of what they are perceiving comes through these emotional senses. Comes through the fact that they are not seeing their client through the mask or through the glass of expectations, predispositions, all sorts of emotionalisms that don't belong there when we have contact with other people. They're seeing quite clearly, in other words. And therefore, they can see things that most of us miss. They may not even be aware of it. Slight gestures, a particular article of clothing. It's amazing how much we say about ourselves just in the way that we dress, in the way that we sit, in the way that we stand or speak. And those who are open to that, who better yet are curious about it, who really want to know. And best yet, those who really want to know because they want to help us, and who've dealt with hundreds of people like us, have read books on all sorts of things having to do with it and all that, are quite adept at reading those signals. And then, of course, when we do a little bit of sharing with them, when we give them an idea of what kinds of things are disturbing us, it's amazing what can come out of that. That's not an argument about psychism, saying that it doesn't exist, and it isn't, on the other hand, a hearty appreciation of psychism. It's simply a statement about our potentials. We are incredibly sensitive creatures. And in general, because of our emotions, because of our ideas about ourselves, most of them emotional, we don't use a tenth of the ability that we have. An example. How many times have you been approached about a certain activity, whatever it happens to be in your own life, and you said, I can't do that? That statement is precisely the reason why you can't do it. For instance, there are those who in their 70s think about what a wonderful thing it would be to read the Old Testament in Greek. And they say, but I'm 70, I can't do that. And somewhere else, there's a 70-year-old who's gleefully learning how to read Greek so he can read the Old Testament, and chances are he will. On the other hand, it may be that we say to ourselves, I can't quit smoking cigarettes. And there we have the not itself, that idea. Now, it's not to say that if we can bring ourselves to say, I can quit smoking cigarettes, and not really mean it, that something's going to happen. But it means that what we can speak from the bottom of our hearts, we create. It was said by a rather wise man once, for example, that you can be anything you want in the world. All you have to do is make believe that you are. That seems rather naive until you consider the fact that if you really do that, and if you're good at it, people will begin to behave as though you are what you make believe you are. And beyond that, you will attract to yourselves materials, people, ideas that will help you to become what you want to be. And before too long, you may discover that you are exactly what you have made believe you are. And then, to be a little sledgehammery about it, we've all done that, is the point of this. Somewhere down in our lives, we've made believe we're something. Some of us have made believe several times and have been through careers and relationships and all sorts of things, making believe we're different things. But somewhere down the line, we pick out something, a person we've known, a character in a book, a character on television, a whole grouping of characters on television, for example. Maybe everybody on Bewitched or something like that. And we become those people. It's our own interpretation. No one's going to recognize it, although I'd like to say that you'd be surprised how many Elizabeth Montgomerys there are running around. Nevertheless, we have used this person as a kind of touchstone, a kind of goal, a kind of measurement for our own personality, for our own growth. We feel like if we can be like them, we're living a good life. There's a couple problems with this. The first problem is that most of us don't know we've done it. And that's a considerable problem, because we may have chosen somebody we really don't want to be anymore, and it's not working out too well for us. On the other hand, it may be that we could choose somebody quite a lot better. And this is a large part of the explanation of why a guru-cella relationship will work. Because the cella will look at the guru and say, I'd like to be like this person. And hopefully we have an enlightened guru, and therefore the person becomes more and more enlightened until they're free of the desire to be like anyone but themselves. And of course that's the crux of the issue, becoming ourselves. Trying on other personalities is useful. It's a way to grow. It's a way to protect ourselves. It's a way to put a kind of barrier between ourselves and the world, the people we deal with, in the sense that it's not us getting rejection, it's Elizabeth Montgomery. But it's not honest. It isn't a clear perception of the world. It isn't dealing with the richness of the world in the way that we could. It's missing a great deal. What it's doing is providing a kind of secondary focus point. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I'd like to oversimplify for a second and say that there is body and there is consciousness. and leave it at that. And say that while you are alive, a consciousness is blended with a body, is focused into it. And in doing that, something's created, a kind of what we call a personality, this amalgam of thoughts, memories, emotions, reactions to the environment, not pure consciousness any longer, but instruments for dealing with this world. Now, when we take another personality, when we create somebody else to be, what we're doing is repeating the process that created us. We, the personality, this center of focus for consciousness, is now creating a new center of focus, an even tinier, more restricted one. And that new center of focus we try to use, in a sense, as our agent in the world. Now, what kind of disadvantages are there should be obvious, in that all the consciousness that's available to us is being pinpointed. It's not being used to the degree that it could be. It's being wasted. Now, many of the Eastern sages in particular have spoken about the idea that the personality itself should function in the way that these little subsidiary personalities we make up do. In other words, what we should be inside ourselves is what we are, infinite. It's a wonderful phrase in the Bhagavad Gita that deserves meditation. The self is infinite. It is no thing. It is not finite. It can encompass the entire cosmos in a single thought. Now, all that consciousness, all that infinity, is the awareness that we strive after in the effort toward enlightenment. And the personality, that part which we use to deal with other people, should be precisely that, something we use, an instrument. Something that we use to aid other people, to share experiences with them, to try and bring into manifestation in this world the most positive things that we can. Happiness, understanding, experiences of enlightenment, kindness, anything that we can bring into it that's positive. Now, if we're not doing that, then the instrument is using us. And it's a tremendous instrument. No computer has ever been dreamed of that can accomplish what the personality, with its wonderful battery of experiences and memories and all those things, can do. It can actually disassociate itself into different parts. It can argue with itself. It can attempt to defend itself from itself. It can, in other words, provide us with endless entertainment. A lot more painful than the entertainment we get on television, but also a lot more profound, a lot more complex. And we can get very much invested into that. Now let me describe to you more concretely what I mean. We can, for instance, walk into a situation and see someone there who in some way threatens us, perhaps a past incident when we were insulted by this person. And immediately a defensive reaction becomes apparent. We think to ourselves either, oh, I want to get away from this person, or this time I'm going to get them before they get me. In other words, the personality part of us is dreaming up all sorts of ways to deal with this situation. Now, for a moment, let's withdraw from the personality to that infinite self. Now, in one way, if you'll pardon me, the infinite self could care less about the hurt inflicted on the personality by the other person. The infinite self has levels of awareness and nuance that allow it to understand that this other person is functioning from their own motivations, that if they inflicted hurt on us, it is because they are in some way hurt, that there is no deliberate action of hurt, there is only the action of hurt that moves from imbalance, pain, ignorance. And then seeing that, the infinite self decides that rather than defending or fighting back, the best thing to do is to try and discover what the problem is and alleviate it. In other words, why does this person feel they have to insult me, and what can I do to make a situation, an environment, an event that will help them to see that they don't have to insult me? And if I'm really good, that will help them to see that they don't have to insult anyone. And we've really accomplished something. In doing that, we have, in a sense, reached the crux of spiritual effort. In general, the emphasis in all spiritual texts and teachings is on getting to that point of infinite consciousness, seeing what's out there, becoming enlightened, becoming a master, becoming initiated, finishing the magnum opus, the great alchemical work, all those phrases. But very little attention is given to what we do once we're there. An interesting thing happens. Some of us, maybe all of us, maybe just a few, have had what we might call mystical experiences. That can range anywhere from simply standing in Yosemite and having a sense of awe and wonder at the beauty, or anything actually. It might be a painting, it might be another human being. But this wonderful sense of timelessness, of appreciation, of delight. And then again, it may have gone all the way to what's been called cosmic consciousness with what's called subjective light, when we have visions of light. And this world effaces into a kind of flatness, and we actually see that this world isn't real relative to the world of our consciousness. We have these experiences, and they pass, and many of us then wonder what we're supposed to do. And the feeling tends to be that, well, I must not really have had the experience, because if I did, I would know what I'm supposed to do. Now, interestingly enough, in most of the teachings, in fact, almost all of them, in the ones that it appears this isn't present, it's simply more veiled, there's constant emphasis on the way up to these experiences on kindness, thinking of the other person before you, doing unto others. Constant emphasis on understanding other people, easing their troubles, lightening their burden, all that sort of stuff. And usually we think of it as the way we get to the experience of enlightenment, and that's partially true. That's the most powerful instrument, the most powerful alchemical process, just learning to be kind. Magic of, instead of being controlled by our personality, using our personality as an instrument to aid others. In a sense, then, it's like spreading this infinite consciousness around. But we can be aware of it as often as we can. We can aid others to reach an understanding of it. But now the question that's really before us is, how do we clear up the emotional senses? What sorts of approaches do we need to take? What kinds of things do we need to keep in mind to help us to open up these reservoirs? And everything really that's been said up to this point has been theoretical and not practical in that sense. So we'll spend the rest of the time discussing what sorts of things we should keep in mind in dealing with the world. Now, as was said earlier, the first thing that's noticeable about the symbol of the moon is that it's always been associated with the feminine and with the idea of motherhood. So if we consider the moon in her guise as Isis, as the great mother of creation, we can first of all ask ourselves a question, and that is, do we wish to trust our mother or to distrust her? Now this is a fabulous opportunity because we don't have to think of our particular mother. She may be worthy of distrust for all we know. We can instead think of the world as our mother. Now, there's a lot of reason why we can do that. First of all, we can point to the infinity of mothers before our mother, mothers of mothers of mothers of mothers, and all the fathers that go with that, and aunts and uncles, and the fact that really we're all interrelated. It's a simple thing for us to draw genealogical trees and argue that we're not really related. We come from this area of the earth, and actually you come from that area, and it's different. Well, it isn't. In this tremendous cosmos, this tiny little speck of a globe, we all share it. Our bodies are all composed of the matter of this globe. Our heritage of experience, wherever we come from, is common in the sense that it's human experience. It's experience of this earth, the weather of this earth, the sky of this earth, the same sun, the same moon. We have a lot more in common than we have apart from each other. And in a very real sense, we are all very much related. especially these days when with our modern communications we have a more and more homogeneous world. More and more we share the same kinds of experiences. But even beyond that, going into the past, going into various mythologies, the most primitive tribes, really the problems, the concerns are the same as what we face. The desire to have a place, the desire to be liked, to be wanted, to be needed, the desire to be a good parent, or a good child, or a good worker, or a good leader, or a good follower, whatever it might be, the desire to be a reasonably happy, reasonably secure, reasonably successful in the true sense of the word, not just financial, but successful in every way human being. We all share that. Whether it be an Aborigine in Australia or someone living in a penthouse in New York, the basic concerns are the same, the worries are the same, the emotions are the same. It's merely the symbols that differ. The Aborigine may be concerned about a drought, and the New Yorker about a mugging, but the concern for personal safety is the same. So, we have this sense of fellowship with the world. We share it as a common mother. Our minds, our emotions, our personalities, our bodies are all made up of the materials of this world. They were born out of it. The only thing we're not sure about is the consciousness. That might be from somewhere else. It might be from this world. We don't really know for sure. And yet, even with the consciousness, we find that if we speak honestly about our deepest experiences, others recognize them. And at a certain level, we discover that all of us share a common kind of consciousness. And some have had the experience of actually sensing the common consciousness in all of us. Many have left us records of that experience, some very surprising individuals who have said, basically, inside we are all the same person. It's the same consciousness inside every one of us. It's merely differentiated in the slightest possible ways. Our experiences, our bodies, our heritages, all those comparatively small things are different, but the essence of the experience is the same. So our origins, all that other outer material of this world is common to us, and also somehow the inner essence is common. Now, if we label all of that our mother, that which gave birth to the mystery of ourselves, we then have to decide if we're going to trust it or not. That's the first step in learning how to use the emotional body. Most philosophy, all metaphysical philosophy, is intended to do one simple thing, to convince you that the world is a lawful, ordered place, that it is not here merely to torture you, that it's here to teach, and that suffering is the byproduct of ignorance. That once you have learned the laws of living, life becomes a beautiful thing. And we run into this in the Tao, in Kabbalah, in sayings of Jesus, all the references to the idea of being like a tree or like a river, for example. If we simply were like the tree, growing naturally, receiving water naturally, bearing fruit naturally, no strife present, accepting death naturally, all of that, no resistance. We don't often see oaks running around the mountains upset. The idea that's boded there is that if we would just settle down and accept the idea that the world is here to help us, to nurture us, to aid us in our growth, and not to hurt us or to impede our growth, we would live much more fluent lives, lives that would flow to the ends that we really most need. Now, we can convince ourselves reasonably. We can look at our lives. We can say, first of all, I have never been faced with a situation I could not solve. And a simple proof of that is that you are seated here. You're all alive. Every disaster, any of you have had to deal with, you've survived, at least in the sense that you're alive, and your curiosity is up. At least that's there too. So you have survived any disaster as it's come, and it's a fairly intelligent extrapolation from that you will be able to survive any disaster that does come, because they're not really disasters, and that's the next level of understanding. The idea that they are a disaster The suffering that you experience in the event is your own invention, if you like. The event is neutral. Now you might say to yourself, well, I don't know, if I got into a terrible car accident and was severely injured, that doesn't seem very neutral to me. And yet, we always get these wonderful stories of individuals who say that despite the fact that they were severely crippled, it was only after the accident they realized how precious life really is. And they took up art and they paint with their teeth. And those kind of examples that are profusely given to us, usually around the holidays, are at least useful to clue us into the idea that it's possible to turn even an experience like that, so apparently awful, into a wonderful opportunity. There's really nothing we can imagine that's so awful that it somehow couldn't be turned to our advantage. We couldn't find something useful in it, something wonderful in it, some opportunity. We judge whether it's negative, whether it's agonizing, or whether it's simply an opportunity. Now, we talked about change earlier, and change is one of the bugbears of our society. Some people want it all the time, and other people don't want any of it. And of course, what we need to look for is the golden mean between those two extremes. And that golden mean is accepting change as it arises. Change is actually one of the most merciful experiences vouchsafed to humanity. Change is what allows us to grow. Change is what gets us out of situations we don't want to be in. Change is what unfolds us. Change is what provides this increasing sense of variety when our awareness grows. Change is, in a sense, one of the most beautiful of all aspects of human experience. And the only reason we might have to fear change is because we've got into the habit of fearing change. We have had a couple hard knocks. We've interpreted them as being very negative, as being real suffering, and we then associate all change with suffering, and we never stop to consider if perhaps we've made an assumption that is not borne out by facts. So if we reconsider, and we look at the idea that change can be quite productive, we can point out, first of all, that there is this tremendous potential within us, mentioned earlier. And we're usually not aware of how deep that potential is. Change is the opportunity to express it, to become aware of it. You may read, for example, about being patient 1,000 times, but until an obnoxious child annoys you for an hour and a half, you won't have a chance to really find out how patient you can be. Because if all that reading stuck, you will not force the patience. If you really see, if instead of being locked up in your own ideas about how the child should behave, or about how the child's parents should behave, whatever it might be, if you just are curious, if you observe the child, you observe your own reactions, you say to yourself, okay, I'm in this situation. I got put in here by whatever powers it be, whether you want to ascribe it to personal stupidity or divinity is your own predilection. But here I am. I might as well make the best out of it. I might as well see what I can do here. And you might even be surprised to discover that you might turn the kid around and you and the child might have a wonderful experience together, exploring something, discovering something. The child might say something that astounds you, that keeps you thinking, resonating for weeks afterwards. Very often that happens, but you must be open to it. Now, it's possible that you've had an experience, and if not, look for it, it's an interesting one, of having that kind of openness in some situation, a movie, theater, whatever it might be. Perhaps you've seen a movie that was really awful, but one thing about it really appealed to you, and you watched for that one thing, and that made the movie worthwhile. But the person sitting next to you didn't notice it. They were so wrapped up in wasting the money, and the waste of time, and the horrible movie, that they never noticed that one thing that might have been just the thing that would help them to realize important things about themselves. That kind of openness needs to be practiced all the time. And the way it's practiced is to observe your emotions and not identify with them. In other words, you walk into a room, you look at a particular face, and fear grips your heart. Maybe it's your boss or something. Instead of identifying with that fear and feeling like your life's threatened and you've got to find out some way to get out of this situation, what you do is you observe the fear. You notice it. This isn't even a matter of thought. It's simply a matter of disassociation, of relaxing away from the situation and seeing yourself in it. So that instead of, I'm frightened, it becomes, isn't this interesting? I've reacted with fright in this situation. And the next step from that is to wonder, maybe afterwards, maybe at that moment, maybe a year later, what reaction might I have had? What if I'd walked into that room when my boss was expecting fear and was jovial and happy and supportive? What would have happened? Probably some pretty magical things. Now, what if we did that? What if we were happy and jovial and we got fired? Do we then decide that never again will we be happy and jovial in a situation that demands fear? No. We observe our reaction again. And our reaction, that we never again must be happy and jovial, is very interesting. It simply means that we have a kind of propensity toward being afraid of the world, that we have a tendency to generalize about our experiences, and most of all, that we have a very high opinion of our perception of the world, of our intellect. In other words, we have never even considered the possibility that maybe we got fired not because we were jovial, but because we missed something else. Jovial may have been the wrong response for the situation. Or then again, there may have been something completely different that affected the situation we were not aware of. In other words, again, we have to look at the situation as a learning experience. I'd like to carry this out a little bit longer, this analogy, but first I'd like to point out that it can be applied to anything. We can be discussing not a boss and a job, but a spouse and a marriage, a relationship between parent and child. Any number of relationships fit into this idea. Now, taking it a step further, we're now out of a job or out of a marriage, or we're in bad sorts with our children or parents, whatever it might be. And the general reaction is one of several, but usually excessive emotionalism of some sort. Either we're angry about it, or we go out and drink ourselves silly, because that's what our hero, who we modeled ourselves after, did in the book that we read when we were 16. Or then again, we simply get despondent, or we get desperate to find another job. That's when the emotional body is out of control. Now, what's it like when the emotional body is in control? We sit down calmly. We find the positive things about our situation, and we also find what we have to do. In other words, we say to ourselves, I do need to find another job. How am I going to go about it? We decide the various approaches we will take, and if it's perhaps a Friday when we're fired, we spend Friday evening or Saturday morning or whatever, a few hours, making a few phone calls, asking suggestions, maybe making out a few lists, getting a resume together, and then we forget about it because we trust the world. That's not to say that a job is going to miraculously come our way. It's to say that the 48 hours spent between Friday and Monday in ulcer-causing worry is not going to get us work. It's not going to improve the situation in any way. It is merely a waste of energy, a distraction. And there are far better ways to distract oneself than that. So we need to seek out positive releases then. We have to choose what emotion we will apply in that situation and not let ourselves be commanded by the negative reaction. So for example, if we're out of work for a week, that's a week of leisure. That's a holiday. And if we have to be a little bit more careful about our earnings, about our spending, fine. Then we're a little bit more careful about it. But we don't let it chew upon us. Now that might be very easy to say, but when we approach the situation and we find that we simply can't release that emotion, that it simply keeps, waves of it keep coming on us, what does that tell us? If we trust the world, we trust that the world is here to teach us, it tells us that there is something else in the situation we need to learn, most likely about ourselves. For example, why is it that we're so anxious? We've thought about the situation, we've laid it to rest. Something else then is being threatened. It might be something as simple as a sense of self-esteem. It might be a sense of letting other people down, something like that. And then we deal with those situations too, just step by step. And the amazing thing about this process is we begin to unravel the knot. It's almost as if the knot begins to unravel by itself. happens faster and faster. One thing leads to another. Because what we don't realize is the single action actually has about a dozen reactions, maybe more. It just continues. For instance, when we decide not to worry about it, and we have an absolutely wonderful weekend, we're open to all sorts of things, ideas, experiences. We may find a job just from that openness. On the other hand, we may go in for our interview Monday morning and be so bright and so cheery and so refreshed after our weekend that we get the job. Whereas if we had spent it all worrying and walked in haggard with big circles under our eyes, we wouldn't have gotten it. We wouldn't have made the same kind of impression. In other words, these simple actions have all kinds of repercussions in our lives. Now, another way to work on the emotions is to differentiate between realities and appearances. Now, the Eastern sages love to talk about that, and unfortunately, it can be a very confusing idea. But if you consider it on the most personal level, it becomes very clear. Appearances include such things as what other people think about you. They include such things as, in effect, what you think about yourself, because that is an appearance of sorts, maybe a little bit more internal, but it's your own appearance to yourself. Realities are simply what you are, what you do, your actions, your capabilities, your potentials. Now, I mean this in the deepest sense. I don't refer to potentials in the sense of job skills. I refer to them in the sense of spiritual potentials. The potential to be a positive influence, to be, in a sense, a font of light in an arena of darkness. All of us have that potential to be positive influences. I remember a wonderful story that someone told me about how they were transferred into an office where the previous manager had been everyone's favorite and had been fired under some very strange circumstances. And this new person who came in received all the hatred and all the blame and all the negativity. No particular reason, just she was the new manager, therefore she was the higher management's darling, and therefore she had something to do, undoubtedly, with the firing of this beloved supervisor. As you can imagine, the first week was disastrous, very painful, and every attempt was made to improve the situation. Nothing seemed to work. It just got worse and worse and worse. This particular person went home, they read Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, which is basically about appearances and realities. And in it, Emerson says something basically like, if you don't like a situation, go in there and change it. In other words, don't go in there and be depressed by the people who are depressed. Go in there and cheer them up. Something's going to happen. Either they're going to depress you or you're going to cheer them up, so you decide which it's going to be. And she went in there, and for about a week or two, she traded compliments for insults, smiles for frowns, and kept at it. And it worked. It worked much better than she ever expected it would. And the effect on her own self-esteem was amazing, because she saw what she could accomplish. She saw what could be done. That simply. Now, I might add this person was a Cancer, so it does tie into the moon. Change can either be like the waves that knock us down, or it can be like the waves that we ride. And the beauty of our potential as human beings is that we can learn how to ride them. That's what we're talking about here. When we're brought into a situation, we need to become not defensive, not very aware of ourselves and what we can do. We need to become all eyes and ears. We need to really be aware of what's around us, really watch, be silent, listen. And what you discover very quickly is that other people in any situation, whether they be perfect strangers or husbands, wives, mothers, are basically screaming at you what kind of reactions they want. It's very subtle when you're distracted with your own problems, but when you're really wide open, when you walk in there and you say, I don't care what happens to me, for the next hour I'm going to just sit here and watch. I'm going to see what's going on here. You will be very surprised at how many messages are thrown your way. And better yet, if you actually walk up to someone and say, what can we do to make this situation nicer? boy, you will have an amazed reaction. Very few people will even think of doing something like that these days, something so obvious. What sort of things can we do to improve this? I'd like to listen to your ideas. Any situation, a relationship, a job, school. And then really listen. Don't be thinking, boy, they're really impressed with me now since I asked that question. Be thinking, what are they not telling me? What are their eyes telling me? What is their body language telling me? What is the gesture telling me? Are they sitting like this and telling me what they want? That sort of idea. And then act on what you see. Now that's not to manipulate. That's not to get a whole plan made up and then work with it. First, go into the center of yourself. Go into that infinite self. And that can be as simple as go outside for a minute and take a look up at the sky. Look at the clouds moving over. Anything that makes you feel a little bit relaxed, a little bit of peace with yourself. And then remind yourself that you're not here to be the Zen Roshi, to walk in and do all kinds of outrageous things to shock these people into some understanding. That you're here simply to be kind, to say a good word, to try and cheer them up a little bit, maybe get them to laugh, convince them that things aren't as bleak as it seems. Give them an example out of your own life. In other words, teach them something you have already learned. Here's the essence then of the situation. If this world is ordered, if this world is here to teach us, then it is also here for us to teach. And the best thing that we can teach is a sense of trust, a sense of affection, a sense of humor, relaxation, those things. And the best way we can teach them is by being them. A relaxed presence in a tense situation does wonders that words could never even approach. A kind word or a good joke does wonders. Now, as an example, I would like to point out to you, those of you who know who Manly Hall is but have not had the pleasure of being in his company at one time might wonder what sorts of things he would talk about in the privacy of his own home. I'd like to tell you that he tells a lot of jokes. He keeps you laughing all the time. Now, what is that? Is that a strange old man who's really kind of lost it in the interim? Or is that the fact that after 80 years of living here and knowing and studying and doing everything he possibly could to get at the mystery of life, he figured out the best thing he could do when you're sitting there in front of him is make you laugh. The very best. Once he's got you laughing, boy, you'll start discovering all sorts of things about yourself. It's amazing what might sneak in. It might even get you to really figure out that laughter's the whole trick. And if we turn into some other traditions, I might add, we'll find a very similar thing. Eliphas Levi, who was a tremendous influence on Madame Blavatsky, was a French magi who wrote some really tremendous works of magical philosophy. He was a tremendous influence on the tradition, both good and bad. He was that rich a source. And one of his real kernels of advice in a manuscript that he gave only to students that was published decades later was that the best textbook for magic was a book by Rabelais. That sense of humor, that ability to laugh at anything, at the most gross things, was the key. If you could have a Rabelaisian sense of humor, if you could find the laughter in the most hideous situation, you were a magician. You'd found the trick. Now, there's a tremendous hint there. There's a romantic side of it. There's the idea that, yes, if I can laugh in the face of death, then I'm truly free. But there's also the idea that if you find the laugh, you've learned to see it, and you can share the laugh with the other people so involved. In other words, maybe you can get a few other people involved in that hideous situation to laugh with you. The right word, the right glance could do it. I'd like to share with you one of my most embarrassing moments, which was when, not too long ago, a rather distinguished Tibetan meditation master appeared in Los Angeles and gave a series of lectures. And at one of the particular occasions, there was a slightly strange mood in the air. There was a large group of psychologists present, and they were academic psychologists, which means that they were very serious people. And this meditation master was anything but serious. He was this delightful old man with laughing eyes, and while they read these incredibly long, pompous introduction speeches, he yawned, he tapped the microphone, he looked around, he made faces. Nobody noticed this. Well, needless to say, within about 10 minutes, I was laughing hysterically and embarrassing myself because I couldn't understand that no one else saw the tremendous contrast between all this serious humbug and the object of it, who was just sitting there bored out of his mind. Now, that laughter may have been the key to the whole situation. I like to think, maybe with a little bit too much self-esteem, that that's precisely what the meditation master was trying to do. He was trying to say, boy, this is pompous, isn't it? Well, everybody for themselves, find anything you can to amuse yourself. I'll just use this microphone here. It's weird looking. That kind of thing. And I might add also that once the dialogue started, it wasn't a matter of minutes before the translator was also in stitches. We never did find out what it was that the Tibetan Lama said to him to make him laugh, but I can imagine what it had to do with. Laughter. Big key, then, to all of this. If we can learn to laugh at the hideous situations, what we're actually learning to do is to laugh at ourselves. And that's the most tremendous thing of all. Because when we laugh at ourselves, in other words, when we laugh at our personalities, we are at that very instant identifying with the best, freest, that infinite part of ourselves. And it's looking at this little puppet, this little personality, and having a terrific kick out of the fact that it just isn't working right at this particular moment. Now, the efficacy, the quality, then, of the work that we can do is a dozenfold what it is when we're completely invested in the personality. Because we can experiment with it. We can toy around. We can throw in something surprising. In a sense, then, what we're doing is we're making life an experiment. That's another key to all this. But a joyous experiment. We're thinking to ourselves, for example, in 10 years of knowing this particular person, we always do the same thing. This person calls up and they complain about how terrible life is, and I spend 5 minutes telling them life isn't so bad, and then they complain for another 5 minutes, and then I agree things are terrible, and then we both complain for 10 minutes and get off the phone, and it happens again a week later. What if this time I did something really different just for the fun of it? What if I said something incredibly outrageous, whatever it might be? Just threw the whole thing off. What would happen? Really surprising things happen, because the other person wants to wake up just as much as we do. And you may be surprised to discover, you may get a good laugh out of it, and they too, if they have enough wit, to discover that you'll say something and they won't even notice it. And you'll say it again, really outrageous and loud, and they still won't notice it. They're just used to that same behavior pattern. But eventually, if you keep it up, and if you're a little bit more outrageous and you wait for the right moment, you'll get it through. And then all of a sudden there'll be a laugh of delight. There's a wonderful technique, for example, that some psychologists in the school of psychology called transpersonal have been using with children who do tantrums. And that is, as soon as the kid starts to kick and scream and all that stuff, they pull up a chair. And they sit there and they watch very intently. And then when it's over, they say, that was great, but I like to see more kicking and less screaming. And it usually works. The child, being far more awake than most of us, appreciates that viewpoint. They understand that they're manipulating the situation and that you're wise enough to see it. And they might actually do it for you next time with more kicking and less screaming. But still, to be able to have that attitude of disassociating from the problem, of having the sense of freedom in it. At the very end of all our considerations comes a simple fact. That absolutely inescapable shadow. We all know one thing. Everybody before us, as far as we know, has died. And it's a pretty good bet that we're going to, too. And just in case we're not sure of it, we're usually given a few deaths to witness or at least be around or something to convince us this stuff's for real, it's not a rumor. Now, that leaves us a whole bunch of ideas. We can get very upset about it, and we can run off and find a religion that will really convince us that we're immortal, and we can just hold on to that. Or we can go the other route and go to Buddhism and say, no, we're going to free ourselves from samsara, there is no self, and suffering's an illusion, that sort of thing. We can find all sorts of approaches, but really in the end, whether we're simply going to die or not, In other words, whether we're immortal or whether we just die with the body, as all the materialists love to tell religious people, doesn't make a lot of difference as far as how we act while we're here. As a matter of fact, if we are simply going to die, it's all the more reason for figuring out the best way to act while we're here. Might as well have fun while we're here. And the simple fact of the matter is that having fun is not in licentious behavior. Having fun is not doing in exactly what we want. That doesn't work out. Most of us have had at least a little bit of a dalliance with some form of doing exactly what we want, and we usually reap the benefits with every bit of pain that's possible. And that's generally the case for every human being. So we need to figure out then, what does make us happy? What gives us a feeling of joy? And you see, this now brings us again back to that idea of happiness, of disassociating from these knots of emotion, from realizing, yes, it may be that this particular neighbor is a terrible human being who tortures me every time I leave the house, and I can't move right now, and there's just nothing I can do about it. But then on the other hand, I'm going to die, they're going to die, I don't have the time to waste. And so the next time we walk out of the house, we give them a great big smile and completely turn around the tables. Or we say something to them like, you know, I've been thinking about all these arguments we've been having, and who knows, I may be dead tomorrow. I don't have time for this. Something like that, too, will work. Throws them off. They don't expect to hear that. In other words, you've broken the game. The game is that everybody, even the staunchest materialist, down deep believes they're immortal. If they didn't, they would not waste all that time on all that suffering. But they have this feeling somewhere down there that it's going to continue, that they can do it. They can sit here and argue with their neighbor for 10 years, 20, 30. Why not? And they're shocked when something happens to remind them of death. And our culture, I might add, is particularly guilty of that, because we make such an effort to keep death away from our eyes, from our ears. We have all our little machinery set up, in a sense, to keep that away from us. It used to be that when someone died, they were in the house for a day or two. Emerson, for example, wrote a wonderful little phrase where he said that even the casket in the living room becomes a solemn ornament in memory. Even that loses its hideousness. There was a valuable lesson for the child, a grandparent, a parent, whoever, someone who died, and there they were faced with death. They were faced with the reality of it. We avoid that and we forget. But it's good to remind ourselves now and again that we were begotten, and that we really don't have the time to waste. Now, if we think of this place as a schoolroom, then we can figure this. If I'm getting paddled, in other words, if I'm suffering, it's because I'm not getting the lesson. And I want to have fun while I'm at school, since I've got to be here. So I better start to learn the lesson. Now, you might notice that there are hierarchies, there are kinds of patterns of experience in our lives. And a simplified, generalized example would be something like this. Perhaps we drive recklessly. This is a very mundane one, but it'll certainly work. And the first thing that happens to us is while we're driving along, we have a prick of conscience about it. We think, you know, I really shouldn't drive like this. And nothing happens. We keep driving like maniacs because that's just the way we drive, or we're late, or whatever it happens to be. Then a little bit later, perhaps 3-4 days, a week, a month, 3 months, we see a magazine article about a really terrible crash. And we remember that time we had that intuition that we really shouldn't drive so maniacally. We sort of said, oh no, it's just superstition, that sort of thing. I've got good reflexes, that kind of response. And then next time around, maybe somebody we know gets in a car accident. And then maybe next time we narrowly avoid a car accident. And maybe the very next time we get bumped. And the next time we really get in a good car accident. Now, it's never that simple. Chances are that actually what needs to be learned is patience. And that lesson will come through a dozen different approaches, not just the automobile. Perhaps the magazine article has to do with something completely unrelated, but the key is that everything that's speaking to us has to do with patience. And if we're alert, if we're curious, if we're open, we pick it up very quickly. And the amazing thing is, when we really make the effort, in accordance with a wonderful old Sufi saying, if we take one step, Allah takes 7 steps toward us, we find ourselves doing things without even knowing it. Guaranteed. We walk into a situation, we're a little bit flustered, we don't quite know what we're doing, and we just go ahead and get it out of the way in the way that seems best at the time, and then later in our leisure we realize, boy, it was the perfect thing to do. Just right. It was that automatic, fluent action that the Zen masters so often talk about. We're that open that we simply function. So, what we need to do then is to stop allowing the clutter of our suffering, of our memories of suffering, of our emotions about the pain that we feel in life. We have to stop letting them clutter up our senses, and we have to put them aside and be wide open. You might remember someone saying that one must be like a child before they can enter the kingdom of heaven. And you might consider that if the kingdom of heaven be understood, if you'll allow it to me, as this incredible infinite state of consciousness, which if you've had it, you will certainly agree is about as heavenly as things can get, then we must be like a child to have that, to hold it, to live in it. And then to be like a child is basically to be wide awake. If you watch a child when they sleep, for example, they sleep. They're heavy. They make a big dent in the bed, bigger than adults do. And then on the other hand, when they're awake, and they'll run you right down to the ground proving it. But they see things. They're really alert. They notice things that adults cease to notice because they think them unimportant. But it's that very sensitivity, that sense of wonder, that sense of awe about the world, that curiosity that makes them so wide awake. They don't make the value judgments that so many of us make, simply that this situation will have nothing for me. For instance, I'm going to the dentist, I'm going to spend a half an hour in the waiting room, and that is a waste of time. That's it. Nothing there. On the contrary, there's all sorts of things in the dentist's office. There's other people. There's yourself and your own reactions. There's the things in the room. And if it's really boring, you've exhausted all that, then there's the opportunity to cultivate a little bit of silence, to really calm yourself down, to really relax, to really focus on listening, being aware of nuances. But I guarantee you that beyond that, you will notice in any situation hundreds of things that are terribly interesting, the tiniest things. Sherlock Holmes, for example, one of our treasured literary characters, is a great example of a certain kind of enlightenment. Because if Sherlock Holmes were sitting in the dentist's waiting room, chances are he would notice a little hair on the chair, and he might notice a little something over there, and he might notice a whole set of things that tell him a lot about who'd been there, what sorts of things had happened. He'd amuse himself that way. The point is, then, that there is always something around us we can learn from. There's always something to be curious about. Even, for example, if we're faced with getting drilled by the dentist. That's the lovely thing. Even that pain can be something very interesting in the sense of a challenge, in the sense of, now, how am I going to respond to this pain? What sorts of reactions are there going to be? Let me try a few things. You might find that you try all sorts of breathing exercises and you relax yourself, and then the pain is 10 times more excruciating than you remembered it last time. But eventually, something else may happen to you where you snap out of the pain. Tremendous experience. You suddenly notice that it's not there. How did it happen? Or then again, notice what the dentist is doing, or the dentist assistant, and see how the pain changes your perceptions. Are they more sensitive? Are they less sensitive? Is your hearing sharper? Is your seeing sharper? Are they both dulled? Every single experience is full of opportunity for learning. And then the wonderful thing, of course, is that nature is a pragmatist. And the more you learn, the more you're able to teach, and nature will maneuver things around for you to teach. You'll meet all sorts of people who have things to tell you, and you'll meet all sorts of people who you can tell things to. Situations will arise where you can aid people with your insights. If you've ever looked at some of these wonderful life stories where people have suddenly turned around their careers and had some tremendous career working with the dying, perhaps, or running off to some country where there are diseases or starvation and working with the people there and really being involved in it. And you wonder, boy, how do they do that? It must be that they're just a different kind of person. They're not a different kind of person. They do it because they have learned enough of a certain kind of understanding that that action becomes the most natural thing in the world for them. They're drawn there. That's where they have to teach. The opportunity arises there. And if we look at it from the outside and we think, well, I'd love to set up a foundation for helping people, but how do I go about it? You see, that's putting the cart before the horse. We're worried about the organization and how many desks are going to be in it, where we're going to get the money, and who we're going to hire as executive secretary and that sort of thing. That's not the issue. Those things come when we really have something to offer. And the way that we have something to offer is in conquest of ourselves. I'll leave you with a wonderful image. You remember all those drawings of St. George slaying the dragon? Besides the fact that there's a wonderful Kundalini imagery in that, the idea that the spear is the spinal column, and the dragon is the spinal fire, and the St. George is the infinite self. There is beyond that, the simple idea of that symbol is representing the human being in us, the part of us that is kind, that wants to help, that wants to put others before ourselves, conquering our selfishness. Selfishness, then, is the root of emotionalism. And the way to clear our emotional senses is selflessness. And the surest technique of all, beyond everything I've told you, is simply to put other people before yourself. To walk into a room and not ask, what's in this situation for me, but ask, what can I contribute here? What can I do for some other person in this room? And one act like that, every once in a while, will do wonders. Because for one thing, you will be shocked at the effect. And when you're shocked with the effect, you'll want to play with it a little bit more. And so I leave you with the final idea that St. George is playing when he slays that dragon, when he gets control over it. Because life at its best, enlightened life, is like play. And when children play, we have perhaps the greatest example of all of an enlightened kind of consciousness. Completely selfless. Picking up personalities, putting them down. Treating other people one way, reversing it to the other. Trying things out. That's the key then. Breaking the old habits and playing. I thank you for coming tonight.